my dad's a commercial photographer, and I grew up literally into photography. And I mean, although I was interested in mostly painting and drawing, photography was always at the foreground, or honestly the background of my interest, actually. You know, photography is this broad sweeping term, and I work with sort of like very fundamental ideas of photography. Because back when photography first started, it was just tar on metal, that the very first fixed photograph ever. And those sort of crude materials are very experimental, and like these guys didn't really know what they were doing. They threw egg whites into a mix, and that created albumin printing, which is, you know, revolutionized the photography field. So what I'm saying is photography inherently is very experimental and artistic and scientific and all that stuff. So to say you're a photographer, I think, entails you're an artist. How I made this picture was I visited Long Lake in Washington. I took a photograph of it, and I also collected the water from the lake. And then I went back to my studio and made a color photograph from the negative that I took. And then from that photograph, I soaked it in the water that I collected from the lake. And over time, the water deteriorates the color layers that are inherent, embedded in the photograph. And this is a relic of that process. The experimental sort of nature of my work, I think that place is always going to affect the outcome. Does that make sense? So I think it's always site-specific, whatever you make, because, you know, the environment or whatever, weather, all these things have this sort of magical circumstances for making works or generate some idea. And I've done works like in a forest and made, you know, trees, photographs of trees made out of those trees. And I think that I couldn't make that work in a place with no trees. You know, desert landscape would be very different. So I think each place has its own circumstances for making their own pictures. I guess looking at photographs in a more sculptural and like the all-encompassing circumstances of making pictures, you can realize that all that is context or something, I think, interesting stuff to make work about. You know, because I think this piece is, I think you can't help think of the narrative of going to the lake, collecting the water, and that kind of journey becomes this sort of strange performance in terms of, you know, you think of the silly guy gathering water in a photograph, and I think all that becomes kind of meaning in the work.